Hello, everyone. It's Eric from Strong Medicine. After recently announcing a new series here on Make America Healthy Again, I was planning for its first deep dive to focus on RFK Jr., because he is at the nexus of both this initiative's organizational framework and its fundamentally unscientific philosophy. However, as I hinted at in the intro video, that organizational framework was likely to change, and we already have our first major shakeup. Vinay Prasad, the FDA's Chief Science Officer and the Director for the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, has resigned, less than 3 months after he was appointed to the position by FDA Commissioner Marty Makary. It should not come as a surprise that Maha's first victim would be the member who is the most outspoken, brash, and, in my opinion, the one least likely to be tempered by outside political considerations. In short, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse, Prasad doesn't give a damn about what other people think or the climate in which he's working. He says what he thinks, and if you happen to disagree, that's your problem, not his. And that attitude is essentially what got him canned so quickly. Now, one could say that since Prasad is no longer has an official position within the federal government, he's not relevant to Make America Healthy Again, and I should just exclude him from this video series. However, I think there's a lot to learn from his rise and fall. The whole Prasad saga speaks volumes about the personalities behind Make America Healthy Again and how dysfunctional this whole endeavor is. So today, instead of RFK Jr., I'm tackling the ousted iconoclast, Vinay Prasad. I'll be talking about who he is and his background, followed by a brief overview of the position of CBER director, the specifics of why Prasad failed in that role so spectacularly, and what our takeaway should be from the whole shit show. Now, apologies in advance, but this video is going to be long. In part, that's because I don't have much time to plan it or edit it. This response has already gotten delayed a week by my own bout of COVID. Yes, it's still around. The video's length is also related to my previous decision to not discuss Prasad on this channel, even when it would have been relevant during the pandemic. Talking about him kind of makes me sad. Not that I wish him any ill will, because I don't. I hope he can put the FDA behind him and have a long, successful career moving forward. But he just feels so full of misguided potential. And whereas I once had a lot of respect for the man, I get why he's become a punchline. Like I said, it all makes me sad. However, now since talking about him feels unavoidable, I'm going to say everything that I've ever had to say about Prasad so that I never feel obligated to circle back to him again. And once more, no ill will, just sadness. Who is Vinay Prasad, and how did he become the physician he is today? He originally hails from the Midwest, did his undergrad at Michigan State University, and got his MD from the University of Chicago in 2009. He completed an internal medicine residency at Northwestern in 2012, and later a fellowship in Hem/Onc in 2015. 2015 also saw the publication of his first book, Ending Medical Reversal, co-written with internist Adam Sifu, who will become his most consistent collaborator over the next decade. I think this book was the moment that Prasad first gained national prominence. Ending Medical Reversal discussed cases where a common and widely accepted medical practice was later found to be ineffective or even harmful once better quality evidence was obtained, what is dubbed a medical reversal. Now, I read the book shortly after its publication, and I found it to be very compelling. The book's thesis was that we should be demanding higher quality evidence before adopting new medical practices than the medical establishment has traditionally done, and that we should be faster to abandon old practices once newer and higher quality data has disproven their effectiveness. Thus began Prasad's famous quest of demanding higher quality evidence for pretty much everything, becoming so dogmatic in its application of evidence-based medicine that anything short of a large, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial with perfect randomization and follow-up was insufficient to satisfy him, irrespective of the intervention being studied. And he would use his disdain for reliance on lesser evidence to harshly criticize the pharmaceutical industry, scientists, and other physicians, professional societies, the NIH, FDA, and CDC. In the memorable words of frequent Prasad critic David Gorski, Prasad weaponized EBM fundamentalist methodology. That became his brand. For example, in a much later Substack post from 2023, he wrote, in his classic style, "As readers know, my philosophy is RCT or shut the up." That language mirrors what he's been using for years. For a while, he was an oncologist at OHSU in Portland. He won several teaching awards there and published academic papers prolifically. During his 5 years at OHSU, when he was junior faculty right out of fellowship, he averaged over 30 publications per year. Granted, many of those were not first authorships, but that is still impressively productive. Local media did stories about him. One from 2017 was already calling him an iconoclast and referred to his solidified reputation of a, quote, pharma scold. That is, someone particularly critical of the pharmaceutical industry. In addition to traditional scholarship, Prasad also became very active on social media. I interacted with him via both public and private Twitter communications a number of times at this point, and he was always perfectly friendly and supportive of me personally. But his online persona could veer into toxic territory as he showed contempt for people who disagreed with him. Emblematic of this time period for him, he entered into a long-standing feud with the aforementioned Gorski, one that began over what should have been a polite disagreement concerning the need and appropriateness of debunking pseudoscience in the public sphere. Gorski, very briefly, Gorski argued that debunking was an important aspect of science communication as it informed the public about charlatans who could harm them. Prasad's argument was that debunking pseudoscience was a waste of time because it lacked the intellectual rigor befitting academic physicians such as themselves. He compared debunking pseudoscience to dunking on a 7-foot basketball hoop. Prasad thought himself too smart to waste time on science communication to the general public, which was ironic in retrospect since his rise to broader fame and infamy came from communicating directly to the public during COVID, after which he was ostracized by most of his supposed intellectual peers. Up until COVID, my impression was that most medical professionals saw Prasad as iconoclastic, bombastic, even narcissistic, but fundamentally still within the bounds of conventional medicine. However, in the spring of 2020, things changed. For one thing, that's when Prasad moved from OHSU to UCSF. But more importantly, this is when the contrarians of academic medicine entered their, quote, golden age, enabled by public fear and distrust of all things concerning the pandemic. The contrarians discovered this huge undeveloped market for medical mistrust, and they used social media to exploit it, initially just for hits of dopamine, but later for wider fame, conventional media attention, and for some like Prasad, money. The major players of the golden era of medical contrarianism fell into 3 camps. First, there were the wellness grifters, most of whom predated the pandemic and came from outside of academic medicine. Second were the ones who focused their attention on hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. And last were the ones who focused their attention on the triad of lockdowns, face masks, and the COVID vaccines. And Prasad fell squarely into this last group. Whereas before COVID, Prasad's social media presence was mostly discussing nuances of chemotherapy trials or the appraisal of the medical literature more generally. During COVID, his social media became increasingly focused on skepticism of the conventional wisdom touted by Anthony Fauci, the CDC, and MedTwitter. To expand his ability to discuss his skepticism to the public in depth, he started his own YouTube channel in 2020 and Substack in 2021, both of which have been equally prolific as his scholarly output. But without peer review to keep his tone in check, these other outlets have been more controversial. In one particularly infamous Substack post from October 2021, Prasad discussed how the normalization of government-mandated restrictions on our lives during the pandemic was analogous to the rise of fascism in 1930s Germany. His argument, it had more nuance to this, but some saw this as Prasad comparing mask and vaccine mandates to the literal Holocaust. But it was really Twitter that seemed to be responsible for the most growth in his national prominence. And the more skepticism he posted on Twitter, the more the skeptics flocked to him. The dopamine which accompanied the follows, likes, and retweets reinforced his contrarian views, making them less susceptible to counter-argument from his academic and medical peers. And that counter-argument against him specifically became very dramatic. I don't know of any medical professional on Twitter during the pandemic who generated the degree of pushback and outright animosity from the mainstream medical community. In response, Prasad's online persona became increasingly abrasive. Last week, in an obituary of sorts for his short-lived FDA career, Prasad's friend Adam Sifu had this to say about him. Quote, "I do understand that Dr. Prasad is, well, divisive. He has strong opinions, and he is not shy about sharing them. He has at times been brash, nasty, and insulting. Being opinionated and insensitive guarantees enemies, and he made them in spades." And that's his friend talking. Here's a clip of him on ZDogg MD's podcast, where he's asked if it's time to reconcile with former professional and social media adversaries on questions about COVID restrictions and vaccines.
Now, what do you think should be done, Vinay? Because there's two camps on this. Like, let's forgive and have a reconciliation about all this and move on and forget it. Why are we beating this dead horse? And others who say, but if we do that, when the next, Marburg pandemic or whatever comes, or bird flu, the same shit's going to happen.
Yeah, I don't believe in forgiveness because, in my opinion, these pieces of shit are still lying. I mean, like, if you want forgiveness, the first thing you have to say is what you actually did wrong. And they're still fucking lying. Well, based on the best information we had at the time, cloth masking 2-year-olds was a sensible. No, it wasn't, you fucking liar. I knew it wasn't. You have to be dropped on your head to think that. You're lying, dude. And just say, okay, fine, I was scared. I wanted to go to my sex party. I thought if the 2-year-old masked up, I'd go have more parties. Just say you were lying. Just say you made shit up.
Prasad also became infamous for aggressively blocking the accounts of people who criticized him, even supposedly blocking some folks preemptively. The hashtags blocked by Prasad and blocked by Vinay trended. People would tweet out that he had blocked them as if it were a badge of honor, as if it was evidence that they must be on the right side of the COVID debate, on the right side of history, even if the infamous contrarian Vinay Prasad was blocking them from responding to his tweets. Prasad got a lot of criticism about how aggressively he blocked people, but I gotta say, I understand Prasad in this one spot. Med Twitter had become incredibly toxic by 2021, where any degree of doubt about the effectiveness of lockdowns, masks, or the COVID vaccines was met with excessive hostility. Some of the same medical professionals who harshly criticized Prasad, I ended up blocking them too, not because they personally attacked me per se, but because they were just being jerks, stifling debate and driving polarization by insisting on ideological purity on anything remotely related to the pandemic. So yes, I also preemptively blocked people on Twitter, on Med Twitter specifically. I often disagree with Prasad, and even when I did agree with a particular point of his attitude was off-putting. But he is also a smart guy who had important things to say, and he was further driven to the fringes by people intolerant of nuance and justifiably intolerant of his frequently condescending tone. None of this is meant to absolve Prasad of his own communication shortcomings. I think the pariah status that he obtained during COVID was largely self-inflicted. It was just really unfortunate because he had demonstrated before COVID that his voice was valuable. But now much of the medical community, particularly outside of the oncology world, no longer cared what that voice had to say. I've been thinking about how Prasad and so many other contrarians within Make America Healthy Again have connections that predate the current Trump administration. Prior administrations would bring individuals together into HHS based on specific expertise and reputation rather than firsthand knowledge of them as people or personalities. And many positions below the cabinet level would span multiple administrations. There was not this effort to replace the entire leadership within the American healthcare system all in one swoop, as what's happened over the last 6 months. But with Trump and Maha, pretty much everyone got replaced at the same time, and most of them all knew each other already. To better understand these relationships and the contrarian to federal employee pipeline, I've attempted to diagram this all out, focusing on prominent academic physicians and scientists who espoused positions on COVID or on medicine more generally that were, let's say, outside the mainstream. This is the ecosystem that amplified Prasad, the ecosystem that dialed Prasad up to 11. These are his people. Most notably, this includes Sifu and a cardiologist from Kentucky, John Mandrola. In 2022, these three founded something called Sensible Medicine, which was initially described as a newsletter, but then developed into a podcast and website with branding and even merch. They described their site as follows. Quote, "The goal of Sensible Medicine is to showcase a range of ideas and opinions about all things biomedicine. We feature contrasting ideas and opinions. The editors themselves will disagree with each other in and about posts. Once upon a time, that was how progress occurred, through dialogue. We work to nurture a home for this type of engagement." You can see the FDA Commissioner Marty McCary and FDA Senior Advisor Tracy Beth Hogue are also in this sphere as frequent contributors to Sensible Medicine. During the pandemic, Prasad also developed a close relationship with an acquaintance of mine, social media personality Zubin Damania, also known as Z-Dog MD. Damania, a former Stanford physician who is an entrepreneur and comedian, he now hosts a podcast and YouTube channel, and he's actually done this for many, many years. And within that space, Damania and Prasad developed a recurring series of long-form discussions on medicine, predominantly about the pandemic, called the VPZD Show. They've done 39 episodes to date, most of which were in 2022, with only one this calendar year back in April. There have been a handful of episodes with Prasad and McCary on together. Watching these episodes, you can see that they are very friendly with one another. Clearly, they get along well, and they're in contact in some degree outside of just this podcast show. That pre-existing relationship between Prasad and McCary was almost certainly a large factor in Prasad's appointment in May 2025 as the director of CBER. I'm sure it also didn't hurt that Prasad's skepticism about the COVID vaccine and his criticisms of the pharmaceutical industry superficially aligned with RFK Jr.'s pet issues. And it also didn't hurt that Prasad's public statements on politics seem to have taken a rightward swing following the 2024 election, including a Substack post in December 2024 that made the bizarre argument that confirming infamous anti-vaxxer RFK Jr. as HH Secretary would actually increase the public's confidence in vaccines, and a Substack post in February of 2025 that echoed many of RFK Jr.'s top hits, even including the unscientific campaign to ban certain food dyes. Prasad was really swinging for an administration position with these, and between courting RFK Jr. and his long-standing friendship with McCary, his appointment to a senior position within the FDA was not a surprise. This brings me to what exactly is CBER anyway? Why did this seemingly obscure position make my list of 12 key positions in Make America Healthy Again? The Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research is one of a small handful of current subdivisions within the Food and Drug Administration. It's responsible for assuring the safety and effectiveness of vaccines, blood products including immunoglobulins, and cell, tissue, and gene therapies. It's that first one, the vaccines, that's most important to the public. The director of CBER plays a central role in determining which vaccines are made available to which members of the American public. Prasad's predecessor as CBER director had been Peter Marks, who had served in that role during both the first Trump administration and the Biden administration. Marks had been forced to resign in March over disagreements with RFK Jr.'s anti-vax, and broadly anti-science beliefs. Marx made his scathing resignation letter public, which stated in part, quote, "As you are aware, I was willing to work to address the Secretary's concerns regarding vaccine safety and transparency by hearing from the public and implementing a variety of different public meetings and engagements with the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. However, it has become clear that truth and transparency are not desired by the Secretary, but rather he wishes subservient confirmation of his misinformation and lies. My hope is that during the coming years, the unprecedented assault on scientific truth that has adversely impacted public health in our nation comes to an end so that the citizens of our country can fully benefit from the breadth of advances in medical science." This is the environment into which Prasad was appointed. Given his skeptical view of COVID vaccinations, particularly for children and young adults, his appointment was met with cautious optimism among anti-vaxxers, and with immediate concerns from the medical establishment that he would limit access to some vaccines, which he subsequently did. While I believe that claims Prasad is literally an anti-vaxxer are false, the outcome might still align with the goals of anti-vaxxers if Prasad insisted on impractical levels of evidence for specific vaccines in specific situations, which is consistent with his MO. Industry, however, seemed more concerned about his take on the other therapies under his purview. Therapies that impact far, far fewer people, but which are far, far more expensive and thus lucrative. Prasad has been a longtime critic of the pharmaceutical industry, and it was expected that his appointment would bring a level of scientific rigor that would otherwise be absent from Make America Healthy Again. And with scientific rigor would naturally follow increased regulation. As just one, albeit indirect measure of this, the biotech-focused XBI Exchange Traded Fund declined very sharply at the moment Prasad's appointment was announced. This brings us to what went so wrong, with his very short stint as a director of CBER. First, for all Prasad's bluster and previous criticism of the FDA, he didn't seem to actually want to do most of the job. As reported by Stat in June, multiple agency employees who requested anonymity to protect against retaliation told Stat that Prasad seemed uninterested in the administrative work of being a center director. One CBER agency official said Prasad rarely attends center meetings with office directors, and that their questions about the budget, HR functions, and IT systems have gone unanswered. Just as it was much easier for Prasad to criticize clinical trials than it would be for him to run one himself, it proved much easier for him to criticize a government agency than helping to run one. Also, it's hard to run a group of people who don't respect you. Prasad had become a pariah in academic circles during the pandemic. People under him at the FDA, at least many people that is, they hated the fact that he was there. Yet, if those were the only problems, Prasad would still be CBER director. After all, most of the people brought to the federal government by Trump seem uninterested in the hard work of actually doing their jobs and are disliked by the career officials who are now their subordinates. So Prasad would have, sort of fit right in with that group. No, so Prasad's downfall was over something much bigger than his personal shortcomings. The Trump administration did not want the scientific rigor, which was the one valuable thing Prasad brought with him. What Trump world wanted was someone who would be anti-regulation and someone whose politics aligned with the Republican Party. Prasad is the literal opposite of this. Yes, he had echoed RFK Jr. talking points, and his COVID-era criticism of mainstream medicine fit into the contrarian narrative supported by RFK Jr. as well as by Macri and NIH head Jay Bhattacharya. But Prasad is not beholden to politics. To him, where his conclusions on new vaccines and biologics aligned with RFK Jr. and the Trump administration's goals, that's great. But where they don't, too bad for them. If biotech companies end up bankrupt because the safety or efficacy of their products failed to meet Prasad's standards, I think he might see that as a victory, not a cause for concern or pause. He was not going to be a friend or a partner with biotech executives. So conflict was inevitably going to be triggered by this tension between Prasad's extreme and dogmatic application of evidence-based medicine on one hand, and the Trump administration's desire to eliminate regulation to help industry make more money on the other. And in the middle of this was RFK Jr.'s contradictory stances that he doesn't trust Big Pharma and thinks extremely well-tested vaccines are dangerous, while he also supports the right to try philosophy in which the public gains easier access to experimental therapies about which the FDA has historically and understandably been very cautious. Of course, Prasad, Trump, and RFK Jr. will be aligned on virtually nothing aside from the mRNA-based COVID vaccines on which they all expressed skepticism. So now we get to the specifics of what led to Prasad's removal as CBER director. There had to be something specific. It was not just about vibes. And there's really sort of like three intersecting issues that came together all at the same time. The first concerned a new so-called orphan drug called Elevidys. Orphan drugs are medications that treat rare diseases that are generally not given much attention by conventional pharmaceutical companies due to limited market potential. They are often developed by smaller companies and are fantastically expensive. Elevidys is recombinant gene therapy to treat a disease called Duchenne muscular dystrophy. This is a relatively rare genetic disease, almost solely affecting boys, with an age of onset around 4 and leading to death at an average age of 30. Elevidys was developed by a company called Sarepta Therapeutics and was approved by the FDA for use in the US in 2023. A course of treatment, which is a single one-time intravenous infusion, cost $3.2 million, making it one of the most expensive medications in history. Sarepta and Elevidys had already run into trouble before Prasad had been appointed. There had been a case of fatal liver failure associated with the medication announced in March. As investors grew concerned, Sarepta's stock price started tumbling from $101 on March 17th, the day before the first fatality was announced, down to $64 on May 5th, the day prior to the announcement of Prasad's appointment. Then in June, a second fatality associated with Elevidys was announced. And in July, a third fatality, not from Elevidys specifically, but from a different investigational drug developed by Sarepta, which had significant similarities. Following this, Prasad requested that Sarepta Therapeutics voluntarily suspend distribution of Elevidys and pause clinical trials on other gene therapies. Sarepta initially refused to voluntarily withdraw Elevidys. After all, it's a $3 million per patient drug. Even though Duchenne muscular dystrophy is rare, even with just several hundred cases born in the US per year, that's a potential market in the rough ballpark of $1 billion per year. $1 billion a year that could be jeopardized by Vinay Prasad's adherence to, quote, EBM fundamentalist methodology. Granted, it's not just Prasad's decision. McCary was his boss at the FDA, and RFK Jr. is McCary's boss. Either of them could have pressured him to change his stance, but they didn't. By July 25th, Sarepta's stock had bottomed out at $12 a share. Prasad entered this dumpster fire well after it was already underway, but it's safe to say the company was not pleased with his contribution to the affair. To give you an idea of how big a deal this was, there is now a class action lawsuit for investors against the company's leadership for misleading them on how safe their drugs are. And the day Prasad left CBER, the FDA lifted their hold on Elevidys. So that was all sort of specific issue number one. But in parallel, at the same time to this, were the more straightforward issues 2 and 3. These issues were also entirely predictable, but their vector was not. Now, if you don't recognize this woman, this is Laura Loomer, a notorious right-wing extremist provocateur, conspiracy theorist, proud self-proclaimed anti-Islamic white nationalist, and Trump confidant. Around the same time as the Elevidys shitstorm hit, she began attacking Prasad seemingly out of nowhere. Why Loomer, someone very far outside the healthcare sphere, would even know who Prasad was is a little mysterious, unless one is more conspiracy-minded and sees this not so much as mysterious as it is suspicious. Even members of the right-wing blogosphere have openly wondered if their sort of colleague Loomer was getting paid off by the pharmaceutical industry. Here's Loomer's initial rant that she posted on her website. Among other things she dug up included old tweets in which Prasad declared his progressive political beliefs, where he mentions his support of Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. So this was issue number 2. Prasad is a Democrat, if not in party registration, in political beliefs. Those who only knew him from his COVID-era contrarianism are often surprised to learn that, since COVID contrarianism resonates much more with Trump supporters. But Prasad is very clearly not a historical supporter of the Republican Party. Loomer also alluded to the third issue. She stated that Prasad was, quote, sabotaging Trump's deregulatory agenda. What she's getting at here is the right to try movement. This idea is born from a coalescence of interests from patient advocate groups, biotech executives, and libertarian and conservative politicians. The gist is that severely or terminally ill patients who have either not responded to conventional treatments or for whom no conventional treatments exist should be given the opportunity to use unproven experimental therapies that have not been FDA approved. These therapies can easily be more harmful than beneficial, but as the argument goes, patients should be allowed to make an informed decision, weighing the risks and benefits on their own. The right to try movement is controversial and full of ethical quandaries. I'm not going to debate here which side is morally superior because it is honestly not clear. But Prasad, with his pro-regulation, high level of evidence approach to drug approvals, he clearly falls more into the camp of right to try is a bad idea. This is the additional thing that Loomer is referring to. And she concluded, Vinay Prasad's presence in the FDA is a portrayal of the voters who elected Trump to dismantle bureaucratic overreach and prioritize American health. His progressive ideology, personal attacks on the president, and actions purging leadership, missing deadlines, defying directives, and overriding experts prove he is not a reformist ally. The Trump administration must act swiftly to remove him before he inflicts further damage on the Make America Healthy Again agenda. Again, why does Loomer even know who Prasad is? You need to wonder if someone pointed her gaze in his direction, and it doesn't take much imagination to come up with a list of suspects. Remember, Prasad's own friend Sifu just wrote last week that he has, quote, made enemies in spades. Loomer's rant was followed a few days later by a very anti-Prasad editorial in the Wall Street Journal and a scathing piece on Prasad on the conservative news website Real Clear Politics, both of which focused less on his politics and more on his approach to drug regulation and the fact that he's anti-right to try. And those are the three issues that came all together all once. Pissing off Sarepta Therapeutics and further cratering their already tumbling stock price, being branded by the right wing as opposing the patient-centered quote-unquote, right to try movement, and having personal political beliefs which are quite liberal. To emphasize just once more, for anyone who has been following Prasad since before the pandemic, these are things that were already known about him or easily predictable. But it was apparently a surprise to Trump's inner circle, and it was enough of one to make Prasad irredeemable. The official statement from HHS on his departure read, quote, Dr. Prasad does not want to be a distraction to the great work of the FDA in the Trump administration and has decided to return to California and spend more time with his family. However, as later reported by Politico, Trump himself decided to sack Prasad after Loomer's attacks, overruling both McCary and RFK Jr. on the matter. With Prasad gone, George Tidmarsh, an adjunct professor here at Stanford and the current director of the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, has been named to also be the acting director of CBER while they look for a long-term replacement. For what it's worth, FDA Commissioner McCary said earlier today that it's untrue that Trump personally intervened to have Prasad ousted, and that McCary was actively working to convince Prasad to return, which I really don't see happening because that would require Prasad to swallow a huge amount of his pride. To conclude my take on this saga, the whole thing is depressing. There are people on both sides of the political spectrum who are cheering Prasad's departure. There are people who are pro-science and anti-science who are cheering it. There are people who are pro-vax and anti-vax who are cheering it. I understand why all those groups had issues with him. And the fact that he comes across like an arrogant know-it-all, that certainly doesn't help generate him any sympathy. As I've said from the beginning of this video, based on what was known about Prasad and the contrasting goals of Make America Healthy Again, this outcome was entirely predictable. Consider the irony in this tweet of Prasad's about Peter Marks, his predecessor as CBER director. 1 week before Marks was forced to resign, Prasad is mocking him for being too anti-regulation, specifically referencing Levinas. When Prasad took over, he attempted to be more pro-regulation than Marks, putting him even more at odds with Maha than Marks had been. Of course, this was not going to work out well. Prasad is a smart guy. Despite his faults, biases, and honestly his emotional immaturity, he may have been the smartest major player in Make America Healthy Again, although that is a shockingly low bar to clear. And even when I think he's been wrong, I also think he has generally acted in what he believes to be in the public's interest, his recent post-election courting of RFK Jr. being a huge exception. Prasad's departure has left our FDA worse off, not because he was the right person for the position. He wasn't, not remotely, but because his eventual long-term replacement will almost certainly be worse. I suspect the next director of CBER will be someone more anti-vax, more anti-regulation, less pro-science, and ultimately less pro-patient, which nicely summarizes Make America Healthy Again in general. Prasad seemingly thought he could play nice with the right-wing lunatics for a few months to gain their trust, and then sneak his pro-regulation leanings into the FDA when no one was paying attention. But when billions of dollars are at stake, somebody is going to notice. While it's hard not to feel some schadenfreude at his ousting, I also feel genuinely bad for him. He did not deserve the position in the first place, but he also did not deserve to be publicly raked through the coals and directly fired by the president for essentially doing his job better than Trump wanted him to. What's next for Prasad? I'm guessing he's going to return to UCSF and resume his former passion of dogmatically applying impractically high standards within his critique of chemotherapy trials. He had an unusually productive career before this, and I expect he will afterwards as well. On the other hand, what's next for us, as in America? Something incrementally worse than what we had before.